Everybody, and welcome back. I'm hoping you're enjoying your holidays and your last few weeks of being Year 12 students before we head into the external examination block and you head out into the real world. The purpose of today's little video is to deconstruct some of the feedback that we have offered to you in your responses to the mock exam questions, and to give you some guidance as far as how you can use the last 3 weeks of the time you have with your teachers to best prepare for the external exam. Now, you'll remember right back at the start of this tutorial series, what I wanted to do for you was ensure that you had all the skills necessary so that by the time we got to the start of the external exam period, the only thing that was unseen, the only thing that you hadn't faced before was literally the questions that they put on the paper. We've gone through a lot of steps, and the feedback from the mock exams will really highlight for us, or has really highlighted for us, particular areas that we can focus on as teachers and particular things that you need to review as students so that you really do feel as confident as possible going into your external exam. So without focusing too much on the negative and without undermining the fact that you will all individually get feedback when you start classes again next week. This is a summary of the common mistakes that we found in your mock exam responses and the best ways to go about addressing those. So just by way of explanation of how we marked the mock exam. As many of you know, I was part of the marking operation for the QCAA last year. And when the exams were marked, each teacher, each marker only marked one criteria. So last year I was responsible for organisation and development, and I marked all of, well, as me and part of a team marked all of the Hamlet responses specifically for organisation and development. Now this means that across the course of you receiving your mark for the external exam, you're actually marked by at least 6 different teachers. So 2 in each of the Qs. So 2 for knowledge application, 2 for organisation and development, and 2 for textual features. And we tried to replicate that in the marking of your mocks. So in each instance, your exam has been read by 3 different teachers. Someone was looking specifically at how you manipulated values, attitudes, and beliefs, how you analysed the text, and how you explored aesthetic features to give you a mark for knowledge application. One teacher looked specifically at your manipulation of the conventions of an essay, how you selected and sequenced your information, and how you connected it for organisation and development. And Mr. Smith had the huge job of marking all of the mock exams specifically for the examination of textual features. Now that wasn't just about identifying spelling mistakes or looking for incorrectly used punctuation. It was also for the correct use of terminology, the use of really good evaluative language, so that we could see that even if your answer to the question maybe had some holes in it, that you were really offering that judgment, that interpretation as part of your response. So when you get your mock papers back next week, you'll find that they are highlighted, often in a range of different colours, and that the colours of those highlights will correspond to the highlighting on each of the 3 pages of your rubric. And that's how teachers have gone through to find evidence of organisation and development, or to find evidence of the way you supported your thesis with information from the text. What we found in the process of doing that is that it was really easy to see where there was a lack of sequencing or where you hadn't actually connected the dots. But that's getting down into the nitty-gritty, and you will certainly see that on your own responses when you get them back. The information that I want to go through today is far broader, actually probably relates to about 90% of the cohort. And as a result, there is something in this little tutorial for everybody to think about and everybody to revise ahead of their external in the beginning of week 4. So let's have a look at the notes that I've prepared. All righty. So here's what it comes down to. So the feedback that we would offer from the mock exam is that by far the biggest problem was that students simply didn't answer the question. So to recap, you had a choice of one of two questions. The first one looked at the examination, specifically Malcolm's examination of Lady Macbeth as a fiend-like queen or evil. And you had to evaluate to what extent you agreed with Malcolm's assessment of Lady Macbeth. And the second question asks you to explore the ways in which contrasts were used. As a general rule, the contrast question was more appropriately answered. Very few people actually attempted it, but it was more accurately answered. And I think that was because the wording of the question required you very much to brainstorm and plan your response before you could write anything, whereas there was something of a trick in the Lady Macbeth question that really did catch most people out. So the first piece of advice that we have to offer is that you have to actually answer the whole question. And the key thing that we found here is that every word is in that question for a reason. Malcolm's assessment of Lady Macbeth is that she is a fiend-like queen or evil. This question required you to consider why Malcolm offered that interpretation of her, who Malcolm is, when he offers that interpretation of her, and why. Very few people actually examined the idea of who Malcolm was to Lady Macbeth, why he might actually think that she's fiend-like, and why it mattered that he said it in his very final speech in Act 5. So when we're considering how we can explore an answer to a question like this, the deconstruction of the question is really important. The fact is, I have about 50 copies of the question paper that I'll be able to use again because they have not a single note anywhere on them. That means that in a lot of cases, students went from reading the question to planning a response and skipped that vital step of question deconstruction and or messy brainstorming. Now, this step is really essential because what it aims to open up in your brain is the possibility of a new response. Because a lot of students skipped that step, what we actually had was simply Lady Macbeth is evil without the idea of Malcolm's assessment of her in that regard, and without the specific use of the words fiend-like. So there were actually, there was probably at least 50% more depth that you could have given your responses simply by engaging in that process of question deconstruction, rather than assuming you knew what the question was asking and getting straight into the planning. I will say for the most part, planning seemed to be quite well done, but that essential step of breaking down the question, thinking about what it was asking, thinking about how the key words in the question actually connect to each other was the best way that you could have ensured that this question, that you answered the question and that the evaluation you were offering wasn't just whether Lady Macbeth was evil, but whether you agreed with Malcolm's reasoning for why she was evil. So first strategy, read the whole question. Second strategy, engage in question deconstruction. You have 15 minutes of planning time during which you cannot begin working in your examination booklet. You are allowed to highlight and write all over the question and your planning paper. That's the only things you're allowed to write on in the first 15 minutes. Please don't skip the step of question deconstruction. Please use that time to really tease out what the words mean, how you could use them, the ways that you could explore synonyms so that your response is really nuanced. And that will actually mean that before you've even begun your working time, you actually have far greater scope to offer a judgment about Malcolm's interpretation of Lady Macbeth, or offer a judgment about contrast. And as a result, the material you have to explore in your answer will be so much richer. Okay, so we've got to know that we've got to read the question and deconstruct the question, you've got to know the play. The reality is so again, this is obviously relevant insofar as the fact that it's Malcolm's very final speech of the play in which he offers the assessment of the dead butcher and his fiend-like queen. And that's part of restoring order and establishing his legitimacy as the ruler, the rightful ruler of Scotland. We actually saw quite a lot of references to the play, specifically to Lady Macbeth's role in the play, that were just inaccurate. Her role, for example, in Act 4, she doesn't have a role in Act 4. She is absent. She is absent for a reason. And so suddenly now giving her lines to say in Act 4 or telling us that she was involved in the murder of the Macduffs is inaccurate and actually undermines your authority as an analyst and as a student of Shakespeare if something as central as whether Lady Macbeth is in the scene or not has actually been missed. Okay, so deconstruct your question, take the time to think about all the ways that you could connect the different words to offer a different interpretation. Know the play well enough that you can be really flexible in how you actually use your knowledge of the play as evidence. And then think about the way you can actually put all of that into an essay. So for the most part, the expectations we had for you to write an essay were pretty satisfactory. The biggest issue, of course, was if you didn't answer the question, the thesis that you offered that then basically formed the backbone of your entire essay was limited. And that limited your marks in organisation and development considerably, because when you look at your rubric, you'll see that the formation of a thesis that answers only part of the question is worth about 2 out of 7 marks. So for a lot of you, even though you did indeed offer a judgment about her evilness, because you only answered part of the question, you only got part of the marks. So it's why it's really important to engage in the whole pre-writing phase without rushing to writing because you think you might run out of time or something. Okay, so then when we're thinking about writing essays, there are conventions that we expect. This is these are things that we've gone through since probably year 7. These are things that must actually be adhered to consistently throughout the whole essay. So one of those, of course, is use your sophisticated language. That's not just about presenting yourself as an expert. It's actually a convention of essay writing. And the reason for that is because your role as an essay writer is as a clinical analyst. Your relationship with your reader is through your knowledge, not personally. So the inclusion of things like slang or colloquialisms really undermine your authority as a scholar, as someone who is knowledgeable, because the audience connects with your personality, not your knowledge. Okay, we want you to have both, of course, but this is simply a convention that we would expect you to maintain. When we're working with a question like the first one, the Lady Macbeth is evil question, this was somewhere where an exploration of synonyms, so a range of language choices, was utterly essential. So if we simply heard you use the word evil 60 times through your essay, not only does it undermine the effectiveness of the argument you're trying to offer, it actually means you've missed a chance to evaluate. Is she evil, or on a spectrum, is she misguided? Is she truly demonic? That's down here. That's where she's actually lost all humanity altogether, and she's something else. She's some other creature. So using synonyms and planning to use synonyms is not only a convention of essay writing, because that it shows that you've got the flexibility of language to explore the topic in a lot of depth, but it also means that by choosing individually different words, you're actually offering an evaluation. So if I say Lady Macbeth is misguided and then build a whole essay around her being misguided, it's got quite a different tone to if I say she's demonic and I build a whole argument around her, the lack of humanity, a fundamental lack of humanity in Lady Macbeth. So knowing that there's this like spectrum of word choice and exploring it, and then thinking, okay, so if I use this one here and then this one somewhere else, does that strengthen my argument or undermine it? Or should I reverse the order so that there's a greater gradation of my argument across, greater gradation of my language across my argument? Is an expectation of writing a really intelligent essay at this standard? And as far as applying the essay writing conventions consistently, this is one that is an absolute. When we're talking about a text where the title of the text is the same as the name of a character, you must identify the text by underlining, or inverted commas, underlining is the convention, every time you're referring to Macbeth as the name of the text. This is a way of ensuring that your audience, your marker, knows the difference between your evaluation of the play and your evaluation of the character. If you don't do it, it actually creates confusion and again, undermines your authority as a writer. There are other essay conventions. That's one that we saw misused throughout our marking process and is such an easy one to fix. You correctly used inverted commas to quote throughout the whole rest of your essay writing, but you failed to correctly annotate the name of the text so that we could see it as separate from the character. And that is something that is really just so quick to fix. Okay, so you already have this in a handout and I've really just put it in here again so that you've got another version of it to connect with before your external in week 4. These are some of the essay writing conventions that you have actually been using since about grade 7. I've organised them by the criteria that they most commonly relate to, but these are simply the basics of how to write an essay. So when we refer to an author, we refer to them by their full name, William Shakespeare, by their last name, Shakespeare, or by the title, the author. They are never, in this particular instance, your friend Will. And that is simply because we are giving them the respect that in this particular instance, we are referring to them because of one of the works that they have written. So using their correct name and their correctly spelt name is essential. You can, however, then refer to characters by their first name, their last name, or their title. So Macbeth is generally Macbeth, but he can also be the protagonist, but he can also then be Thane of Glamis, Thane of Cawdor, and thereafter the king. He can be the dead butcher. You can, refer to him in the same ways that other characters refer to him, particularly if it helps to make your argument, okay? We refer to a text in present tense. So the message of a text is always relevant. Okay, so that's why we use present tense to analyze. And what we mean by that is we say, rather than saying, Macbeth undermined the authority of the king when he started listening to witches. He did, right? We say, Macbeth undermines the authority. And what that means is that the reader hears that the message of undermining authority is still something that we should think about. There's a cautionary tale for us even now 400 years later. And if I focus on the present tense, the idea that undermining authority, undermining legitimacy is a problem, then I consider the ways in which undermining leads to Macbeth's demise and what I, as an audience member, should take from that. Okay, so present tense when we analyse, because that helps the reader to see that the message still has relevance to them. Okay, well, you can read through the rest. These are the sorts of things you have probably got comments about on your feedback from your 3 markers. These are so easy to fix. These do not require you to, have big, long conversations with your classroom teacher. These are things that you can go away and focus on improving in individual little practice paragraphs, simply by typing up perhaps your mock response and correcting it for yourself, and really examining how you can strengthen the work that you are doing just by improving some little consistencies. All right. Sadly, one issue that Mr. Smith faced was that there are a lot of words that are used really commonly in essay writing, and so they should, but which are frequently misspelled. Now, we aren't necessarily talking about unfamiliar words where, you know, we would expect that it's not part of your general conversation, and so you might not necessarily know how it's spelt or how it's used. These are words that are probably used every day, and certainly in the case of some of the ones at the bottom of this list, have certainly been used every day in your Shakespearean study. It's really important that commonly used words like these are spelt correctly, because otherwise you actually lose all of your marks associated with spelling, because there aren't a lot available, and the differentiation between them is you get 2 marks for spelling if you consistently spell unfamiliar words correctly. You get 1 mark for spelling if you consistently spell familiar words correctly, and you get no marks for spelling if you don't spell familiar words correctly. So let's have a look at some of these. Know the difference, know which is which. Please go back and look at your own work and see which ones you may have missed. So quiet and quite, or rather, as they appear in this list, quite, which is an adverb, a way of defining how much of something happened. And the second one is quiet. Okay, so if we are talking about what kind of person Lady Macbeth was, you know, before she got the letter, you could describe her as quite dominating. That's the first word. Or you could have said she was a quiet woman. Know which is which and use the correct one. Okay, the who's and whose. So the first one is an abbreviation for who is. So if you are referring to who's coming to dinner, who is coming to dinner, then you would use the first one. If you are asking who owns something, whose hat is this, that's the second one. So Lady Macbeth, whose husband is Macbeth, would be the second of them. It's a relative pronoun. The next two sets of synonyms homonyms I'm not even going to go through by now. If you do not know the difference between your there, and theirs and your twos and twos, you have to go and revise this, please. These are far too frequently used incorrectly for Year 12. Femininity, most commonly what was just left out was the second IN, so it just became femininity rather than femininity. So just check your spelling there. The word to describe someone who has a lot of different names given to them, like Thane of Glamis, Thane of Cawdor, is title. Now, if you are familiar with the spelling conventions, when we add a second consonant in after a vowel, we actually make the vowel say the short form of its name. So when we incorrectly spell title with T-I-T-T-L-E-S, we call it tittles. Okay, so then suddenly your authority as a writer is being undermined by the fact that you're telling me that Macbeth bears 3 tittles. So using the word titles correctly is another way of using your authority. The ones at the bottom have all been explored in my previous tutorials. These are essential to not just the exploration of a Shakespearean text, but specifically this Shakespearean text. So I would expect that you know how to spell tragedy, the correct throne, so the one that we sit on, not the past tense of throw, the correct scene, prophecy or prophecies, and chivalry and chivalrous. And kudos to all those people who did actually explore the conventions of chivalry in either of the questions, because it was actually quite well done. Okay, so how do you get better then? What can you do between now and week 4 to ensure that you are prepared? All right, so first things first, go back and create some scene summaries. So if you haven't annotated your paper version of the text, or if you haven't annotated your printed version of the text, there's your first step. Create scene summaries. Who's involved? What happens and what order do things happen in? You need to have this basic information so that you're aware whether a character has already exited the story by the time that you are making reference to a scene. You need to know what's happened before, because that may have actually shaped why they behave the way they behave in the scene that you're referring to. You need to note who's not involved, because that is actually sometimes as relevant, particularly in the case of Lady Macbeth, as the characters who are involved. You need to do some character summaries. So here, what we're looking for is not so much what stays the same, but what changes. So, across the course of a text, we should see character development. We should see character change. So looking at what kind of person Macbeth was in Act 1 against what kind of person he is by Act 5, and then being able to work backwards and say, well, where did that happen and why, is how you create a character summary. Being able to talk then about the fact that Macbeth was brave and noble before, brave and noble, but with the propensity for ambition before he met the witches, and then became legitimized by the witches' prophecies, is a way of actually unpacking the character in a bit more detail. Yes, you do need to be able to quote directly. Certainly, we know that the QCAA favours the use of paraphrasing, being able to talk about what happens in a scene without necessarily quoting directly. However, when you are talking about the power of individual words to express a particular idea, then the best way, of course, to do that is a direct quote. Important thing to note, if you are making reference to a direct quote, like when Lady Macbeth shouts, "Unsex me here," it's important that you do indeed know what she means when she says that, that you understand what the power of those particular words would be to an Jacobean audience. So it's not just a case of her saying she doesn't want to be female anymore. She says, "Unsex me here and fill me from the toe top full of the direst cruelty." So there is an assumption that she cannot be both feminine, female, maternal, and have what is necessary in her blood to support her husband to kill the king. That is a trait associated with masculinity. She says, take my woman's milk and fill me instead with the bitterest of gall. So we're looking at that idea that she wants to fundamentally change her makeup as a person so that she has what it takes to be the support that Macbeth needs. Okay, now there are a number of references to that expectation of male behavior against female behavior. And if you're going to use a quote to explain that, bring forth man, children only, for example, then you need to be able to correctly identify the power of those words for the audience at the time. Okay, you also probably need to revise some of your literary devices. So great references to Hamasha, really impressive. Good references to literary devices like equivocation, correct identification of symbols and themes in a lot of cases. But there are obviously a lot more available to you. And so it's worth just reviewing those and being able to explain not just, this is a metaphor, but why you think Shakespeare used that particular metaphor, or in the case of this question that we had, why specifically does Shakespeare use the simile fiend-like to refer to Lady Macbeth? So I think in all of the papers that I marked, I actually only read one single response where the use of the word fiend was deconstructed. Now that's really disappointing because we are talking about a fairly central word, not only in the question, but actually in the evaluation of her character. So that's probably important that we not just identify it as a literary device, but actually be able to understand what its power was. Okay, now this is just an example of a infographic that you might be able to find to actually just get straight in your own mind who's who in the zoo, where their stories go. Particularly like this this kind of character map, because you'll see it looks a little bit like a train station, to be honest, but it actually has a different color for each of the characters. It uses movement across the page to actually show you the idea of a character really journeying away, like geographically away from the other characters, where their line ends, so where their color ends is obviously where their story ends. It's just a great way to see who would be present in a scene, as I've mentioned with Lady Macbeth, who's not present in a scene, and why that might be relevant. And something like this, which has a lot of negative space on the page, would then allow you to annotate it to make it as useful for you as possible. This is on my class page, so you're welcome to grab a copy of it from my class page and to explore it in a bit more detail. But look, infographics are available all over the internet, and one of the reasons we study Macbeth is because it's such a well-supported, well-resourced play, and we want you to have access to the great thinking of people who've gone before you so that you feel really confident about what it is you need to do. Okay, so I'm going to post this one obviously today. One thing that you will see if you've been following the YouTube series is that, when I did question deconstruction and essay writing, when I did essay writing as part of the mini series on specifically writing your analytical essay, I didn't post then a final product, an essay written from start to scratch. And that was quite deliberate. When we did the mock, our focus was not so much on how much do you know and what kind of great mark can you get, but how are your processes developing and how are they working for you? The feedback that we're offering here would say you have good working knowledge. For the most part, you know this play. You actually knew your job. But everybody can strengthen their response to the unseen essay question style by not skipping steps in that pre-writing phase. So do engage in question deconstruction. Do engage in brainstorming before you go into your planning. And think about all of the conventions that you have been working with for years, so that the version of your knowledge that you present is as authoritative as possible and that you come across as credible as possible. Okay, so as is always the case, if you have any questions, any feedback, please let me know. Following on from this, of course, will be the final video in the series on essay writing, which will be a complete essay. May have to do it in 2 sections because there's obviously quite a lot involved in that process. But until then, see you later.